My name is Scott Scooter Braun, and if you heard what I heard, you would never forget. I'm the grandson of two concentration camp Holocaust survivors. I'll be sharing the story of my grandmother, Eva WOHLBERG Braun. My grandmother Eva was born in HAJDÚSZOBOSZLÓ, Hungary in 1930. She had a really good upbringing. You know, there are probably about 100 Jewish families within a town of probably 20,000, 30,000. My grandmother lived with her parents, her grandparents, and her younger sister, Agnes. My great-grandfather was a distributor. He kind of sold magazines and newspapers and postcards for the local spa. And they lived in a home, you know, with the whole family together. And I think in her younger years, she thought she had a really good life. They were part of a local synagogue. They went to Hebrew school. They went to regular school, but also Hebrew school, where they learned how to pray and they learned how to read Hebrew. And so they had a Jewish identity and a religious Judaism, but they also, when she was younger, felt a part of Hungary. My grandmother, you know, was a loving older sister. Her sister was a year and a half younger than her, Agnes. She talked about her childhood as being fun, and she had a lot of joy. My grandmother was always filled with joy. Even with everything she lived through later, she always was full of joy. So she really, in her younger years, didn't know that there was any difference between her being Jewish and anyone else being any other religion. She thought they all lived together, they all got along, and they had a really good life. It wasn't until she was in high school when she started to find out. Two boys called her and her sister, they spit on them in school and called them a dirty Jew. And she came home crying, and they went in, and the principal said he will not have this in his school, and he would rectify it and he would take care of it. But then shortly after, they sent the principal packing, and they kicked her and all the Jewish kids out of the school. And that's when she realized some things are definitely changing. And for the rest of her high school experience, she would take a train into another city to go and try to graduate kind of high school. And unfortunately, the Germans came as Hungary was a voluntary ally of the Nazis in 1944. From talking to my grandmother, I call her Ma. So I just want to say, when talking to Ma, she didn't want to talk about it as much. It was very hard for her, and I always pushed to get the stories out of her. But the one thing I got is that just one day there was a ghetto. One day there was getting kicked out of school and taking a train to another school for a while. And then one day they picked a part of town and they assigned it to, that's where the Jews now live. There was no more having her own room. It was her grandparents, her grandfather had asthma. And suddenly they all lived together. And she doesn't even remember how they got food or what they went through to get that stuff. But even in the ghetto, like, my great-grandfather was respected within the town. But suddenly, you know, these people that he knew were the enforcers of this ghetto. And my grandmother used to say that they weren't any better than the SS, the German SS. They were just as cruel. And she knew some of them. Like, this is a small town. So they would see people get beaten and everything else, but she never experienced anything like that. She would witness it and she would see it, and she was scared, but she does remember there was still joy amongst the kids. They had each other, and they would go play in the street. They had one street in the ghetto they were allowed to play on, and they would go play until one day they were told to board a train. 400,000 Jews were deported from Hungary in 2 weeks. It was all happening so fast. She was scared, but she didn't really understand what was taking place. They knew there was war in Europe. And then one day, my grandmother called it a transport. It was a cattle car. And they rounded up all the Jews of this village. They didn't even know where they were going. They didn't know these were death camps. They had no clue what was about to happen. And they took my grandmother, a 13-year-old, 14-year-old girl, and her, 12-year-old sister, and her grandparents and her parents. At the time, I think it was 23 or 26 members of her family, and then all these other families, and they just shoved them on the cattle cars. And the cattle cars still smelled like cattle cars. If you had to use the bathroom, you did it in front of someone. There was no way for anyone who was sick to be separate. They were just shoved on these cattle cars not even in a humane way for cattle. Even on cattle cars, you make a certain amount of room for the cattle. They didn't do that with these people. They just shoved them on until there was nowhere else, and they closed the door and they sent them on their way. Some people died on those cattle cars, and you'd have a body next to you, and you're trying to get air, and you're trying to see where you're going, and you have no idea. And the fear of that experience, you're huddled with your family, and the doors open, and they bring you into this camp with this sign that is now so famous, that now we know to be the home of Auschwitz, this horrible death camp. My grandmother was a 14-year-old girl, and in the ghetto, to protect her, they wanted her to look older, to look stronger, so they cut her hair. They dirtied her up a little bit because there were horrible stories about what happened to women. And when they got to Auschwitz, her looking older is the only way she thinks she lived. She's in line, 23, 26 members of her family, but she's really with her parents and her grandparents and her younger sister, Agnes. And there's SS soldiers everywhere. There's dogs barking, vicious dogs barking at her. And they're walking in this line, and all of a sudden they get to this SS, who she came later to know was Dr. Mengele. When she gets to the front, they point her family in one direction, and for some reason, Dr. Mengele looked at her and pointed her in the other. And she didn't know about who was going to live or who was going to die. All she knew, at a 14-year-old little girl, she just didn't want to leave her family. So she started crying out, and she just tried to go with her family in the way he said. He says, no, that way. And she started saying, no, I want to go with my mother, but she didn't speak German. So she's saying in Hungarian, she's crying for her mother, his mother's crying for her. And that was her first experience with violence. The SS sicked one of the German shepherds on her, and then they beat her until she was unconscious. She said the last thing she remembers of her mother's face was her mother pale, not knowing what to do, as she couldn't go with her. And she never saw her sister or her father or her mother or her grandparents or any of those 23, 26 members of her family ever again. She was unconscious when they were finally led away. So she doesn't know what happened to them or how they died. When she woke, they brought her to a shower and they shaved her head to toe. They took all of her items, because at that point she had a small bag, and they took all their items and they put her in barrack number 8. And when she found out later was that there was another shower. They took her family and, just like them, told them to take off their clothes. They're going to shower and take their items away. But instead of water in this one, they gassed them. And then they burned the bodies. And the reason they knew this is because Jews who were put in the line she was in, the Germans didn't want to carry the bodies to the crematory, so other Jews had to come in and carry those bodies and put them in the crematory one after another. There would be smoke, and the smell, she said, it was this nothing like you've ever experienced. Is what she found out, that was the smell of flesh. She was 14 years old, and suddenly her whole life was gone. She was alone, and other women in the barracks explained to her what she needed to do to survive. You have to understand the things that the SS did. Your first day in Auschwitz, when you were in your barrack, they would come to you to make you know you were a Jew, and they would take these naked women and they would take hot paint and put Star of David's on their back directly onto their skin with hot paint. She felt like a zombie at that point, but she just started doing what it would take. And every day there was one barrack that was a so-called bathroom, only one for everybody to go use. And you would go in there, and if you used it too long, they would come in and beat you. They would give you one thing of what they called soup per day, but it was really mush. They talk about these places like labor camps, or she doesn't even know why they kept her alive, because it wasn't like they were doing real work. They would take her at 14 years old, and every single day, 5 hours in the morning and 5 hours in the afternoon, she would have to stand in a straight line so the SS could count her to make sure no one was not there, no one escaped. But no one ever escaped from Auschwitz. But just in case they made a mistake, and they would have to stand straight line, even if there's a rock, you stand on the rock. Then they would make them kneel for hours at a time and just be there. Some mornings they would make them run in a circle naked, and Dr. Mengele would come in and he'd point at the ones that lived and ones that died almost every day. Some went to, used for human experiments, experiments that were not legal, experiments that they did because they saw them as almost like living cadavers. Even the barracks, there was almost a hierarchy. Some barracks, you had these beds or you have cots. They weren't really beds. Some just had nothing. You'd sleep in the dirt. Barrack 8, where my grandmother was one of the better ones. So they had these cots and multiple women in these cots piling on top of each other at times and sleeping, and repeat the same thing the next day at 5 hours in the morning and 5 hours at night, naked, standing still, kneeling, running in a circle while Dr. Mangala would just judge you if you were worthy of living that day. One day, they were in line and you weren't allowed to speak or call out. You had to be in the straight line, or they might shoot you or sick a dog on you or just send you to your death, whatever it was. And there was a transport coming in, and my grandmother saw her cousin, Edith, and she couldn't believe she saw someone alive that she knew. In the shock of the moment, she yelled out her name, and the other women literally told her to shut up because they could die. And she couldn't help it. She screamed out Edith's name, and a woman smacked her to get her to stop so they wouldn't die. And she passed out, and they poured water on her. And when she could later, she saw and heard that Edith had been put in barrack number 20, which was the worst barrack. That barrack had no cots, no beds, no blankets, nothing. Just sleep on the dirt. When she went in there, she found Edith, her cousin, her aunt, and her aunt's sister. And they were alive. Even though she had a good barrack in barrack 20, she just wanted to be with her family, the only family she had left. So the women of barrack 20, even though they had no room to even sleep on the floor, they made room for her so she could sleep with her cousin and her aunt. And her aunt started to look out for her, started to take care of her, started to make sure she was okay and make sure that she would still make it to her line every day to be counted. Shortly after she started sleeping in barrack number 20, one day there was some kind of incident. Someone spoke up in barrack number 8, and the next morning, everyone in barrack number 8 was gone. The entire barrack was sent to the gas chamber to set an example. She hadn't gone to the worst barrack to be with her cousin and her aunt. She would have gone to the gas chamber. There was one time where they were doing the standing for hours and they were told to kneel. It was normal, kneel for hours. And a new woman from a transport said, Jews don't kneel. We don't kneel in our religion. And to make an example of her in front of all of the women, they put her in the middle, and they had all the dogs attack at the same time. My grandmother tried to close her eyes and look away, and they told them to all keep looking, and the dogs took this woman apart in front of all the women. When they were in barrack number 20, there was a woman who they let in who was pregnant. The Germans allowed her to be there, and she would kneel and she would stand and she would kneel no matter how pregnant she was. Other women would help her, but she would not collapse. My grandmother vividly remembers this experience of watching this woman give birth and this beautiful child. And for 2 days, they let her play with her child, her newborn baby. And then they came and they took the mother to the gas chamber. And the next day, they took the baby to the gas chamber. She somehow survived Auschwitz over that year with her aunt looking out for her and her cousin, her aunt's sister. And then they got sent after a year to a work camp. They'd wake up in the morning and it was the winter. So they'd have to walk for miles at a time. And there were 3 different types of jobs. The one she'd always try to get was the bomb building, because it was indoor and it was the winter. And she would say, like, by the time she got there, she was almost half dead. And then you would do the work and have to walk back. When the war was almost over, they just decided to ship these Hungarian women to Bergen-Belsen. And Bergen-Belsen didn't kill as many people as Auschwitz, but the difference was when you got sent in Auschwitz to the gas chamber, they didn't see you die. You know, certain Jews had to go get the bodies and cremate them. But in Bergen-Belsen, they weren't even making an effort. They were just piles of corpses. My grandmother saw these just piles and piles of bodies, and everything smelled. And She said the good part was it wasn't just SS. You would see some German soldiers, and some of them, the inhumane things that were going on were too much for them, so they would be kind and give you an apple or give you something. And they started to see signs of things that they didn't see at Auschwitz. They would see American planes fly over, and they would always be delighted. And they'd ask her, like, how did you know they were American planes? And she said, because the German soldiers would start shooting up at them with their guns, like that was going to do anything to the plane up there. But the Germans were afraid, and they were excited because they knew something was happening by the fear of the Germans. April 15th, 1945, the British liberated Bergen-Belsen, and they announced over a loudspeaker in every language that you are free and to stay calm and that the war is over. And she said in that moment, lots of people died. The excitement of freedom killed them because their bodies were so fragile at that point. She said the way that the British soldiers looked at them, they were horrified. They were human skeletons. And she couldn't keep the food down that this one soldier gave her. And she said that probably saved her life because other people, they ate too fast and they died. After they were liberated, she became incredibly sick with typhoid fever, which she couldn't move. She could barely talk. She couldn't do anything. She said she would remember just lying there thinking, okay, this is it. The thing that kept her going, she remembers, was a Jewish Palestinian soldier. She remembers he was wearing the Star of David, and she was so shocked to see a soldier wearing that. And he looked at her and he told her that she had pretty eyes and that he's sure she's a beautiful girl. And she thought, I'm a girl. And then I could be a girl again. And maybe I'll be a girl one day. And she said that that thought of being a girl again kept her alive. She and her cousin Edith and her aunt sister, they survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen together. And then they were given options, especially young girls were given options to go to the United States as part of an immigration program, but she didn't want to go there. She wanted to go back to Hungary. She knew her father would be there. She just felt like he had survived. He was strong. He would be there and take care of her. So she and her aunt and her cousin, they all boarded a train. She doesn't remember who put them on it or how, but they went back to Hungary, and her aunt and her cousin were from Romania, so they continued on past. She didn't know what became of them. Obviously, communism and other fighting happened. But when she got back to Hungary after all that, that's when she realized how alone she really was. And you're talking about a 15-year-old little girl. She was from HAJDÚSZOBOSZLÓ, a smaller town, but she knew she had uncles who lived in Budapest, and she found them. She went into Budapest and they were shocked and excited to see her. And they were really good to her and they started to take care of her. But she still missed her mother and her father and her grandparents, her sister. And things were really, really, really hard for her. She felt like she survived for nothing. She lost everything. She had nightmares. She would scream in the night. The anxiety, the pain. I think she was 18. It was 3 years she passed. And there was a dance in Hungary. A lot of like Jews try to find other Jews, and they would do these functions. She was there, and she was a girl again. She was a pretty girl with pretty eyes. And this strong guy asked her to dance. And he asked her who she had, and she said, her uncles. He goes, what about your family? And she said, I have no one. And he said, I'll take care of you. And that was my grandfather. He never left her side after that. And she said that her life started when she met him. The kind of love that they had was very, very special. She had no one, and she found him, and they started a life together, and they had 2 beautiful children, my Aunt Aggie and my father, Irvin, both named after her sister and his brother. And they didn't just start a new life together. They survived another war together. You know, the Hungarian Revolution, the Russians, they had to escape Hungary in 1956 with a small little girl and a small, little 2-year-old boy. I think a lot of people are always like, why did they stay in Hungary? Why did they start a life there? That's all they knew. My grandfather had his mother and his sisters. This was their home. This is, where they were from. My grandfather, he has a famous line. He said that I wasn't Hungarian. I was just born there. He would never let us go visit. I could see where my father was born. I didn't get to go until after he passed when I was 14. And I got the whole family to finally go because I wanted to see where we were from. But he was too angry, too upset with his country that he loved betraying him and his family. The reason why they decided to leave is my grandfather was trying to be in dental school and start a new life for them, and a bullet came through my father's window by his crib. He once again gave up everything. He made a deal with a guy in his dental school that he would give him all the possessions he had collected in those years, their apartment, everything, if he helped him escape over into Austria. He didn't want the family to go until he knew it was safe, so he did it one night. My grandmother would tell stories of like men would disappear and then they'd send word, but they wouldn't come back, they couldn't risk it. And my grandfather came back and put, I think it was a stone or something, on the table, and he said, this stone is from Austria. And in a horse and carriage, I think it was 2 horse and carriage, he arranged for him, my grandmother, their family, and then the rest of his family's 2 sisters, their husbands, all of them, he got them over in Austria. And there was an opportunity, there was an organization that was bringing in refugees, Jewish refugees to the United States, and they qualified, and I'm the first Braun ever born in the United States because of it. They named me Scott because it sounded American. He always talks about the American dream. It wasn't about him. He always said the American dream is about your children. You come here to work hard so that they had an opportunity to live the dream. Just the resilience of these people. You know, to go what they went through and then have to go through more and more and then to come, you know, out of the Hungarian Revolution, escape, and then be refugees and come across it's not like they were flying on a plane, they came across on a boat and having to start all over. First in a refugee camp for 6 months, then find a neighborhood in Queens that had other immigrants and start a life hoping for something better than the cruelty they had been through time and time again. There are beautiful stories. I told you about Edith, her cousin and her aunt, and when they separated, she doesn't know what happened to them. She didn't know if, you know, the wars in Europe, she thought she'd never see them again. She didn't know what happened. And years later, she's in Queens. I think she said she was getting groceries and she was walking down the street and this older woman's walking by her talking to her friend, and she's passing her and she hears her voice and she walks about another 10 feet, drops her groceries and turns around and says her aunt's name. And they lived 3 blocks away from each other. They didn't even know for all those years. And they hugged and they cried. And she found out Edith lived in Chicago with her husband and was a professor. And, you know, there are beautiful, beautiful things that came out of this pain. But I think it was hard for her. She fell in love with someone named Joseph Braun. And her name was Eva WOHLBERG. And she became Eva Braun. And for people who don't know history, Eva Braun was the girlfriend of Hitler. And my grandmother here's an Auschwitz survivor who's been through everything that she's been through. And she would call AT&T and someone might think she's playing a joke and yell at her, how dare you call yourself Eva Braun? And she'd have to live through that crap again. I always try to think of it as, she was, maybe I should go by Eve. Or I said, no, you get to claim it. You're the best Eva Braun ever. People ask like, what about my grandmother helped her survive? And I think about it. I think first and foremost, luck. I think luck plays a big role. If you ever knew Ma, she had a light about her and a will, and she was so vibrant. I have to believe even that hurt, starving, alone little girl, you couldn't put out that light. There's a will that she had that was contagious, and I think even in that dark moment, that will probably kept her going. I just believe there's always a plan. She was supposed to go through that. She was supposed to meet my grandfather, and I'm supposed to be here telling this story. I think my grandmother wanted me to know where I came from and who her family was. I don't think she necessarily planned on telling me a lot about the Holocaust. I think I was a curious kid and I wanted to know everything. So I think for her, she just wanted her kids and her grandchildren to be happy. She didn't want us to know her suffering. I just wouldn't let it go. They didn't like to talk about it that much, but if you push them, they would. I would get them to talk by asking them about our family, asking them about Agnes, asking them about their father, asking about what happened. You know, who was the original Irvin my dad was named after? Like what happened? They would talk about their family because they wanted those memories to be with us. And I think that there was a power in that. But my grandmother, she more wanted to talk about who her family was before they were lost. And she would tell us how she lost them, but she never wanted it to be that was the memory. She wanted us to know that she loved her sister Agnes and that their sister loved to play. She wanted us to know that her parents loved her very much. My grandmother used to say a lot that she believes all of that pain is why she got all of us. How does being a Holocaust survivor's grandchild affect how I move through life? It made me great at business and probably not so great at intimacy, because until recently, until my own personal life got flipped upside down and I started to do deep personal work, therapy, I woke up every single morning wondering who is going to come take this away from me, who is going to come and hurt me or my family or my loved ones or my friends. How do I protect people I love? That was my first thought every morning I got up, is what's going to happen tomorrow, instead of understanding how beautiful the present moment really was. I missed out on years because of that trauma. And I let that fear affect so many of my decisions until I was so unaware of the present that I couldn't see it was breaking right in front of me. And then when it did, I was shocked. And I was forced to look in, which is interesting because the word baruch, to pray, actually means to look within. I think being a Holocaust survivor's grandchild prepares me for really dark things, and I don't really wish that on anybody. I don't want my kids to be like that. You know, I have to prepare them for never again. I have to make them aware of the world that they're coming in. I want them to be proud, not afraid. And I think when you grow up in a family like that, it can make you incredibly powerful in certain ways, but it can consume you too. And I'm still a work in progress, like all of us. Because I have grandparents who survived the Holocaust, something I do in my everyday life is tzedakah. I give back. I think if a statistician met me on the day I was born and understood my family background and I said, I'm going to end up here, they would have said this is mathematically impossible. I've lived such an incredibly fortunate life with 3 most beautiful children that I think it's very important that I make an effort to give back and be kind and stand up. As my father and grandfather used to say, when there's no man in the room, stand up and be a man. And I think I'm working towards living that kind of life. Most of us don't even know what it's like to be hungry for a week, let alone over a year. And then to be put through that and the torture and all the different things of losing family members and no time to grieve. And they chose to be kind, gracious, giving people. That's the greatest lesson, that they give me perspective. Whenever I think my life is hard, I look at what they went through and I think you have no excuse but to be grateful and to be a good person. The other thing I need to add that I got from my grandparents, really got from Ma, is that hate is not mine. And my grandmother had every right to hate, every right, and she chose not to. She was kind or she ignored it. That's one of the greatest lessons. I don't carry that hate when it comes my way. I smile, I either ignore it or I engage it with kindness. If someone has that much hate in their heart, it has very little to do with me. To me, understanding the Holocaust gives us incredible life lessons on the role of the bystander, how we need to be there for each other as a community. The Holocaust may have killed 6 million Jews, but there were 12 to 14 million people actually killed. So this is always shocking for people. They're always like, okay, how old were you when you found out about the Holocaust, that your grandparents are Holocaust survivors? I don't remember learning it. I have known about the Holocaust as far back as I can remember. It was something I always knew. It was something I was always probably carrying a lot of anger as a young kid. I wanted to fight. I wanted to find Nazis. I wanted to find their kids. I wanted to show that we were strong. I wanted to show that we're not going to die again. I wanted to never again. I was down in Atlanta when I was in my early 20s, and my brother Adam was backpacking South America. And I thought backpacking was like something rich kids did to escape life. And I realized that the kids he was with, and not him, they were all broke. They were just going hostel to hostel, $5 a night, $15, 5-hour bus rides. And And I was reading his blog, and I was so moved by it. I was like, he's living an adventure. And I said, Adam, where are you, and what do I need to do to join you? I bought a one-way ticket to Chile, and I backpacked across 4 countries with my brother for a month. And I was in a hostel in Buenos Aires, and I was playing chess with an Israeli who was in the hostel with me. And great guy. This other guy walks into the hostel, and he's 6'2", dirty blonde hair, blue eyes, really good looking guy. When I came to the hostel, someone came up to me and greeted me and didn't make me feel like left out, showed me a place I could sleep. And I saw he was kind of standing there on his own, so I got up and I walked over and introduced myself. His name was Paul. And we talked, and Paul was German. And he was a really good guy. And the night before, when he first arrived, when we woke up in the morning, we found out that there had been an incident. There was a kid from Austria who said, I'm getting the fuck out of this hostel with all these dirty fucking Israelis and these fucking Jews. And Paul was in the same room as him, as were these 2 other girls. And they were like, one girl was Colombian and the other one I think was American. And they were disgusted by his behavior, and they were like, you should leave then. And Paul didn't say anything. And he's like, these fucking Jews, you guys should get out of here too. And he left. And I heard the story and asked Paul, did you say anything? He goes, he was just ignorant. I didn't need to say anything. And I told Paul a story, I think it was called the T4 program. Before Hitler went after the Jews, he went after the mentally challenged and the crippled. And in 1938, when the German population found out that that program had been going on, it was the only time Hitler was almost thrown out of power because it was too close to home. Not enough people knew Jews, but too many people knew people in those situations. And they were so outraged that they almost threw him out of power, and he denied it was happening. He shut down the program. And I told Paul this because I said, Paul, you have to understand the power of the bystander. I'm Jewish. If I said something, he expects it. But if you're a German Christian, if you said something, he'd have to think twice. And he kind of heard me, and, we talked about it for a while, and then we went about our business. The next day was Friday, and me and my brother found out one of the oldest synagogues in South America was there in Buenos Aires, and we wanted to go to the service. And we said, does anyone want to come? And everyone just wanted a party. It's Friday night. And Paul said, I'll go with you. And we went, and it was a beautiful ceremony. We were singing and swaying and people holding each other, and me and Paul and these strangers are swaying together. And then the next night, we're out drinking, and Paul came up to me around 2 o'clock in the morning, and he started crying. And he started saying how, I want you to know why I'm backpacking. He goes, my grandfather came to Argentina, and my father never talked about his father very much. I always wanted to know why, and who was he, and what was the situation. And at the very end of his life, he returned to Germany. And my father was very upset because they said his father was an alcoholic after the war, and he was abusive to his mother, and he wanted nothing to do with him. And I said, well, I want to meet him. And Paul went to meet his grandfather and find out the truth. And Paul found out that not only was his grandfather a Nazi, but he was one of the highest ranked Nazis, and he was part of Hitler's cabinet. And I'm not going to say the name out of respect, but this is a very, very well-known Nazi who now I know died in Germany. Paul, after his grandfather died, had nightmares because there were rumors, I don't know if this is true, but that Hitler was incestuous with the wives of his cabinet. And Paul told me while he was drunk, crying, that he had nightmares that he was Hitler's grandson. And I had heard kids come to me and say, oh, I feel bad. My family's from Germany and they were in the army and I'm so sorry. And, the guilt had taken over. But now there's this kid standing in front of me who I've become friends with, who I just gone to synagogue with, and he's telling me he might be related to Hitler himself. And I had been looking for that kid my entire life to just put a beating on. He continued on to tell me, crying his eyes out, that he was sorry and that he would never, ever be a silent bystander again. And that he would have said something if he had the chance to that Austrian kid the day before, and that he would never let anyone hurt me. And that when he was swaying with me in the synagogue, he felt the warmth and he wouldn't let anyone do anything to my people anymore, and he would stand with me. And I believed him. And I started crying too. And we started crying and we held each other. People could change. And generations could change. And people don't come out hating. And I'm still friends with Paul. And I still believe him. And if he ever gets to see this, I appreciate it. So I actually asked all my best friends who I grew up with who knew my grandparents recently, non-Jewish friends, like my best friends in the world. And the average answer was 200,000 Jews died of the Holocaust. These are guys who grew up with the education, knew my grandparents, and they still didn't know. And they're my best friends. And that made me realize that we don't do enough talking and teaching. You know, we're mad at people for not speaking up for us, but are we really sharing our history? So I think we have a responsibility to share, but then it's important that other generations know it, non-Jews alike, so that they can be there for other minorities. Coretta Scott King said, every generation has to learn the lesson all over again, but we don't have to make the mistakes again if we learn the lessons from history. So I think that is why it is so incredibly important to teach these things in schools, to educate people, because we're starting to get into a place where we don't know who the experts are. And we're getting into algorithms that just become echo chambers for hate and whoever's the loudest. And that doesn't serve anyone. I think the reason Holocaust is incredibly powerful is because it shows us what can happen if we let fear and hatred win. How do we never let this happen again? Not just for Jews, but for anyone. I think it's important for my kids to know where they come from so they can draw that strength. Knowing your heritage, knowing your culture allows you to draw on a wisdom and a strength that's far beyond yourself. And understanding what they survived and who they were, like I said, it gives perspective. And I used to be sad that she's not going to be here. They're not going to get to feel that love and understand the stories. And yeah, that's true. But she gave me the best of her. And now it's my responsibility to give the best of her to them. I think being the grandson of Holocaust survivors impacts how I raise my kids, and the fact of like, I'm aware of what kind of evil is possible in the world. I don't think my grandparents have to believe that as much as they did the never again, there's a part of them that doesn't want each generation to wake up with the anxiety that they did, or that my father did, or that I inherited. And I want them to understand what they come from, but understand they can be present and that they can't live in fear of tomorrow. They can be aware of tomorrow, but they can't live in fear of it. The thing that I always hold on to, my grandfather died when I was 14. He was in Dachau. My grandmother died. My son turns 7 tomorrow. My grandmother died 8 days before he was born. She got to know my older son, Jagger. She never got to meet Levi. My brother had twins, Bela and Dylan, the day after she died. And we always joke around that she was such an all-star that God traded her for 3 first-round picks. The thing that always fascinated me was that my grandmother saw a level of evil that very few people on this planet will ever have to experience. And she saw people who really wanted to exterminate and truly kill other people put in power. And she was one of the powerless. And she saw the absolute worst of humanity. And she had every right to hate. And she had every right to be cruel. And she had every right to judge. But she never was. She was the kindest person in every single room. She was Mom to all my friends. Everyone loved Mom. And I always think about that. She didn't need to be like that. So when I'm watching what's happening in the world today, I just think about her a lot. And I don't want to hate anybody. I promised before my grandmother died, I promised her that we would never forget, but more so that my children would know who she and who were. And they do. If I could say anything to the family that was lost in the Holocaust, I think I would say to them that, like, this family has a real love for life. You didn't die for nothing, and we're still here, and we're populating, and we got beautiful babies. And Ma and Apu made it. Joseph, Braun, and Eva WOHLBERG. They made it. And they built a beautiful family together, and they lived a strong life, and they told us about you. The thing I wish the most that people learn from, like, the Holocaust, the dangers of anti-Semitism, is just the dangers of hate in general. One of the most important poems written to come out of the Holocaust was written by a Christian pastor who talks about, you know, when they came for them, no one said anything. When they came for them, no one said anything. And he says at the end, when they came for me, there was no one left. I think the ultimate lesson of the Holocaust needs to be that the reason you stand up as a bystander is because it could be you. The reason I think it's important that Jews have a homeland is the same reason I think it's important that anyone has a homeland. Knowing your roots and having an understanding of your history allows you to have a wisdom bigger than yourself and a safety. And I think every person on this planet is looking for safety and prosperity. And when you can go to a place and reconnect to your roots, it's incredibly powerful. There are no words for me to describe how proud I am of being Joseph and Eva's grandson. They are my mom, my Apu. And one of the luckiest things about my identity is being associated to those two people. Ma was the light of every room. She was curious. She was funny. She played beer pong with my friends. She danced all night long at any party we had. She could cook up anything. She just loved life so much. And like I said, for someone who saw the worst of humanity, she chose to love anyway. And she chose to move forward and build something new and build something beautiful. My grandmother was a little girl when this happened, and all our children deserve a better place, and they deserve for whatever crap we've inherited to put that stuff behind us and choose to not be hateful. Carrying my grandparents' legacy would mean to me strength, kindness. Everyone always says, oh, it's about never again. For me, it's just never giving up. Never stop believing, never stop pushing. It's like my grandmother's story when she thought she was dying at the end, even after she was liberated. And that soldier came up to her and he said, you have pretty eyes. You're going to be a pretty girl. And she realized she could be a girl again. And that's what kept her alive. The idea that she could just be a human being again. I carry that responsibility.